crystalline walls of the Galactic Council chamber stretched upward into darkness, their surfaces pulsing
To
with the
them,
soft
he was
blue
nothing
light
more
that
than a
witnessed the
specimen
rise and
from a
fall
backwater.
of 1,000 civilizations. Marcus Chen stood in the center of the vast circular space.
Human
His
Marcus
simple
Chen
maintenance
of the
coveralls
Sol
a stark
System.
contrast to the
You stand
elaborate
before this
ceremonial
Douglas
armor
House.
and flowing
Marcus
robes
didn't
of the beings
flinch.
that surrounded
As the
him
sole
in ascending
survivor, he
tiers.
carried the weight of 8
The air
billion
hummed with
human
tension
lives on
and
his
the subtle
shoulders.
vibrations of countless
An was
translation
tested with
devices.
speech right to gratia
Representatives
banks
from
to
47
cancel
different
Karathian Vine
species
based
watched
and
him
render.
with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright disgust. To them, he was nothing more than a specimen from a backwater planet, a representative of a species that had barely learned to travel between stars before stumbling into galactic politics with all the grace of a falling asteroid. High Magistrate Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire raised one of her forearms, the gesture causing the murmur of conversations to die instantly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority that had sentenced entire worlds to oblivion. "Human Marcus Chen of the Sol System," she began, each word carefully enunciated through the universal translator. "You stand before this council as the final representative of your species." Marcus didn't flinch. He'd known this moment would come ever since the Harmony's Edge had been captured 3 months ago. The diplomatic mission had been humanity's last desperate attempt to negotiate peace after the incident at Kepler Station. It hadn't gone well. Now, as the sole survivor of that mission, he carried the weight of 8 billion human lives on his shoulders. "The charges against your species are numerous and severe," Velter continued, her large, multifaceted eyes reflecting the chamber's light like fractured diamonds. "Violation of the Galactic Neutrality Accords, unprovoked aggression against the peaceful Korathian mining vessel Stonerender, the destruction of the sacred Nixari meditation satellite, and, most damning of all, the development and deployment of weapons of mass disruption in violation of the Treaty of Cosmic Harmony." A low growl emanated from the Karathian section. Ambassador Grexmore, all 12 feet and 800 pounds of him, leaned forward in his reinforced seat. "The humans fired first," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "Our vessel was conducting legitimate mining operations in the asteroid belt of the Tau Ceti system when they attacked without warning." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Veltar silenced him with another gesture. "The human will have his opportunity to speak. But first, let the record show the full extent of these crimes." The chamber's central projection system activated, filling the space above Marcus with a 3-dimensional hologram of the Tau Ceti system. Red markers appeared at various points, indicating the locations of the alleged human attacks. Marcus watched, his jaw clenched, as the prosecution painted a picture of humanity as a violent, expansionist species that posed an existential threat to galactic peace. What the hologram didn't show was the Karathian vessel's real purpose in the Tau Ceti system. It hadn't been mining asteroids. It had been preparing to harvest the barely inhabited human colony on Tau Ceti 3. The U.S. Freedom, under Captain Sarah Rodriguez, had arrived just in time to witness the Karathian ship powering up its orbital bombardment systems. But who would believe the word of humans against the testimony of species that had been part of the galactic community for thousands of years? "The evidence is clear," announced Counselor Zixbury of the Nexari Collective, her telepathic voice echoing directly in the minds of everyone present. "Humanity represents a clear and present danger to civilized space. Their aggressive tendencies, combined with their rapid technological advancement, make them unsuitable for continued existence within our galaxy." Marcus felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. Getting emotional now wouldn't help anyone. He'd learned that much during his 3 months in Zephyrian custody. "However," Velter continued, "this council is not without mercy. We do not seek the complete annihilation of your species." A pause, heavy with implication. "We offer humanity a choice. Submit to complete subjugation. Surrender all your weapons, accept permanent monitoring stations in your system, and provide a tribute of 1 million humans annually for labor in our mining operations, or face the consequences of continued defiance." The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the environmental systems. Marcus looked around at the assembled representatives, seeing the mix of satisfaction and anticipation on their faces. They thought they had him cornered, that humanity would choose slavery over extinction. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. "The human will now present his species' response," Veltar announced. "Be aware that this decision is final and binding upon all of humanity." Marcus stepped forward, his movement causing several of the more nervous species to shift in their seats. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their assumption that he would beg or plead or try to negotiate some middle ground. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that had once made corporate executives nervous when a maintenance engineer discovered their illegal waste disposal methods. It was the smile of someone who had spent their entire life fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable, solving problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. "Honored Magistrate," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I've listened to your charges, and I've heard your generous offer." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. "But before I give humanity's answer, I think there are a few things this council should know about my species." Veltar's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the response she'd been expecting. "You may speak, but be brief. The council's patience has limits." Marcus nodded and began to pace slowly within his designated area, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know, it's funny. Every species in this chamber has made the same fundamental mistake about humanity. You've looked at our short history in space, our relatively primitive technology, our small territorial holdings, and you've assumed we're weak." He stopped pacing and looked directly up at the Carathian section. "You, Ambassador Grexmore, believe strength comes from physical power. Your people are impressive. Strong enough to crush steel with their bare hands, tough enough to survive in environments that would kill most other species. But do you know what humans call a creature that relies solely on physical strength?" Grexmore's small eyes narrowed dangerously. "Enlighten me, small human." Marcus's smile widened. "Extinct." A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Several representatives exchanged glances, their confidence beginning to waver. "You see," Marcus continued, turning to address the Nexari section. "Counselor Zixpri, your people pride themselves on mental superiority, telepathic abilities that can dominate the minds of lesser species. Very impressive. But you've made a critical error in your assessment of human psychology." The Nexari counselor's mental voice carried a note of irritation. "And what error is that, primitive?" "You assume that because we can't read minds, we're mentally inferior. But you've never encountered a species that's spent its entire evolutionary history learning to hide its thoughts, to deceive, to misdirect. We've been fighting psychological warfare since before we discovered fire. Every human interaction is a complex dance of hidden motivations, unspoken agreements, and carefully concealed truths." Marcus turned to face Veltar directly. "And you, High Magistrate, represent a species that believes civilization is measured by how long you've maintained your technology and territorial control. Thousands of years of peaceful expansion, careful resource management, and diplomatic stability. Very admirable." Veltar's crystalline features remained impassive, but there was something in her multifaceted eyes that suggested wariness. "Your point, human? My point is that every single species in this chamber has made the same mistake. You've confused stability with strength, age with wisdom, and size with power. You've built your entire understanding of galactic politics on the assumption that might makes right, that the strong naturally dominate the weak." Marcus stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet intensity that somehow made it more threatening than any shout could have been. "But humanity doesn't come from a stable world. We don't come from a planet where evolution favored the strongest or the smartest or the most psychically gifted. We come from a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. Ice ages that should have wiped us out. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for decades. Meteor impacts that killed everything else on the planet. Plagues that reduced our population to a few thousand individuals." The chamber was absolutely silent now. Even the environmental system seemed to have quieted. "Do you want to know what we learned from that experience?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We learned that survival doesn't depend on being the biggest or the smartest or the most advanced. Survival depends on being too stubborn to die when everything else gives up." He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every representative who would look back at him. "You've offered humanity a choice between slavery and extinction. You think we'll choose slavery because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate." Marcus's smile returned, and this time it was genuinely terrifying. "But you've forgotten something important about humans. We're the species that looked at the impossibility of space travel and built rockets anyway. We're the species that saw diseases that killed 90% of the population and invented vaccines. We're the species that figured out how to split the atom, map our own genetic code, and build machines that can think." He spread his arms wide, encompassing the entire chamber. "Every impossible problem you can imagine, some human has already solved it. Every certain death scenario you can conceive, some human has already survived it. Every absolute defeat you think you can inflict, some human has already turned into victory." The silence stretched on for long moments. Finally, Veltar spoke, her voice less certain than it had been earlier. "And what exactly is humanity's answer to our ultimatum?" Marcus's expression grew serious, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 8 billion souls behind it. "Humanity's answer is this. We choose neither slavery nor extinction. We choose a third option that apparently never occurred to this council." "And what option is that?" Veltar asked, though something in her tone suggested she already feared the answer. Marcus looked up at the assembled representatives, his eyes hard as diamonds and twice as cutting. "We choose war." The eruption of shocked voices and outraged protests filled the chamber like a thunderclap. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting simultaneously, their translation devices struggling to keep up with the cacophony of different languages and communication methods. Through it all, Marcus stood perfectly still, his smile never wavering, waiting for the chaos to subside so he could explain exactly what humanity's declaration of war actually meant. And in the depths of space, 8 billion humans received the signal they'd been waiting for, and began to show the galaxy what their species was truly capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The age of human diplomacy was over. The age of human defiance was about to begin. The cacophony of outraged voices gradually subsided as High Magistrate Veltar raised all 4 of her arms, the gesture commanding immediate silence through millennia of ingrained galactic protocol. Her crystalline features remained composed, but there was something in her multifaceted eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of uncertainty that she couldn't quite hide. "The human speaks of war," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with cold authority. "Does he understand the implications of such a declaration? Humanity numbers 8 billion across 12 systems. The combined military might of the Galactic Council represents over 400 billion sentient beings across 1,600 systems, equipped with weapons that could sterilize entire solar systems." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information for the first time. "Those are impressive numbers, High Magistrate. Very intimidating. I'm sure they've been quite effective at discouraging resistance from other species you've encountered." He began pacing again, his hands still clasped behind his back, moving with the calm confidence of someone discussing the weather rather than the potential extinction of his entire species. "But you know what's interesting about those numbers? They're based on the assumption that this would be a conventional war." Ambassador Grexmore's massive form shifted in his reinforced seat, the movement causing a subtle vibration through the chamber floor. "What other kind of war exists, small human? Will your species attempt to use harsh language against our battle fleets?" The laughter that rippled through the chamber was short and sharp, cut off abruptly as Marcus turned to look directly at the Carathian ambassador. His expression was patient, almost pitying. "Tell me, Ambassador," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity, "what do you know about guerrilla warfare?" Grexmore's small eyes narrowed in confusion. "I am unfamiliar with this term. Insurgency tactics? Asymmetric conflict? Resistance movements?" The blank stare from the massive alien was answer enough. Marcus turned to scan the rest of the chamber, seeing similar expressions of puzzlement on faces across dozens of species. "Fascinating," Marcus murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. "You've all been playing the same game for so long that you've forgotten there are other ways to play." Counselor Zixpre's mental voice carried a note of irritation as it echoed in everyone's minds. "Explain these concepts, human." "Your word games grow tiresome." Marcus stopped pacing and clasped his hands in front of him, adopting the posture of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. "Of course. Let me tell you a story about something that happened on my homeworld, back before we achieved spaceflight. It's a story about a war that lasted 20 years. The chamber's projection system activated again, but this time Marcus was controlling it, accessing the historical databases through his neural implant. A 3-dimensional map of Earth appeared above his head, with the North American continent highlighted. "This is Vietnam," he said, indicating a region in Southeast Asia. "A small country, maybe 30 million people, armed primarily with weapons that were considered obsolete even by our primitive standards at the time. Simple rifles, basic explosives, equipment that was decades behind the latest technology. A second map appeared, showing the continental United States, and this was their enemy. The United States of America. 200 million people, armed with the most advanced military technology on the planet. Aircraft that could fly faster than sound, weapons that could level entire cities, surveillance systems that could track individual targets from orbit." Marcus looked around the chamber, noting the renewed attention from the assembled representatives. "Now, by your logic, this should have been a very short war. The stronger force should have overwhelmed the weaker one in a matter of weeks, maybe months at most." Veltar leaned forward slightly. And what was the outcome of this conflict? Marcus's smile returned, sharp and predatory. The smaller force won. The silence that followed was profound. Several representatives exchanged glances, their confidence beginning to show visible cracks. "Impossible," growled Grexmore. "A weaker force cannot defeat a stronger one. It violates the fundamental laws of warfare." "Does it?" Marcus asked, his tone almost conversational. "Tell me, Ambassador, what happens when you try to use a hammer to kill a mosquito?" The Carathian's confusion was evident. "I do not understand the relevance of this question. The hammer is stronger than the mosquito, isn't it? More massive, more solid, capable of applying devastating force. By your logic, the hammer should win every time." Marcus gestured, and the chamber's projection system displayed a slow-motion image of a hammer swinging through empty air, while a small insect buzzed safely away. But the mosquito doesn't try to match the hammer's strength. It doesn't stand still and attempt to absorb the blow. Instead, it does something the hammer can't. It moves. It adapts. It strikes when and where the hammer can't reach, then disappears before the hammer can respond. He turned to address the entire chamber. "That, honored representatives, is guerrilla warfare. It's what happens when the weaker force refuses to play by the stronger force's rules." Counselor Zixpri's mental voice carried a note of disdain. "You compare your species to insects?" "When necessary," Marcus replied without hesitation. "We're remarkably adaptable that way." The projection changed again, showing a series of historical conflicts from across human history. The American Revolution, 13 small colonies defeating the most powerful empire on the planet. The Spanish resistance against Napoleon, farmers and peasants tying down the finest military force in Europe for 6 years. The Irish Republican Army, a few hundred fighters bringing the British Empire to the negotiating table. The Afghan resistance, first against the Soviet Union, then against the United States itself. Each conflict appeared in the projection, showing the vast disparity in military strength and the eventual outcome. Do you see the pattern? In every case, the supposedly weaker force won by refusing to fight the kind of war their enemies expected. Veltar's voice carried a note of forced confidence. "Your primitive history is irrelevant here. Space warfare cannot be conducted by small groups hiding in caves and forests." Marcus laughed, and the sound somehow managed to be both amused and deeply unsettling. "Can't it? Tell me, High Magistrate, how many supply lines does your military depend on? How many communication relays? How many refueling stations, mining operations, manufacturing centers, and transport hubs?" He gestured again, and the projection displayed a three-dimensional map of local galactic space, showing the vast network of shipping lanes, supply routes, and critical infrastructure that kept the Galactic Council's civilization functioning. "Your empire spans 1,600 systems," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "That means hundreds of thousands of potential targets scattered across thousands of light years, each one essential to your continued operation." The projection zoomed in on specific points, highlighting key installations, and every single one of those targets has the same weakness. They weren't designed to withstand attack from an enemy that doesn't follow your rules of engagement. Ambassador Grexmore's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. "What rules do we follow that humans do not?" Marcus turned to look directly at him. "You fight to conquer. You fight for territory, for resources, for strategic advantage. You fight because you want to rule over the defeated enemy." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Humans fight to survive, and when we're fighting for survival, we don't care about rules or honor or keeping infrastructure intact for future use. We care about making the other side stop trying to kill us." The chamber fell silent again as the assembled representatives began to grasp what Marcus was suggesting. "You're threatening to attack civilian targets," Veltar said, her voice tight with something that might have been fear. "I'm not threatening anything," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm explaining the nature of the war you've chosen to start. When you threaten a species with extinction, you remove any incentive they might have to follow civilized rules of engagement." He gestured once more, and the projection showed a detailed schematic of a typical Galactic Council supply depot. This is Mining Station 7 Alpha in the Rigel system. It produces antimatter fuel for your entire Fourth Fleet, 200,000 workers, mostly Carathian, with minimal defensive capabilities because it's located deep within Council space. The schematic highlighted various critical points: power generators, containment systems, command centers. A single human, properly equipped and properly motivated, could infiltrate this facility and turn it into the largest explosion in recorded galactic history. The resulting chain reaction would sterilize everything within a 50-light-year radius. Grexmore rose to his full 12-foot height, his voice a rumbling growl of outrage. "You dare threaten genocide?" Marcus looked up at the massive alien without flinching. "I'm not threatening genocide, Ambassador." "You are. The only difference is that I'm explaining the consequences of your threat." He turned to address the entire chamber again. "You see, that's the fundamental misunderstanding here. You think this is about territory or resources or political power, but from humanity's perspective, you've declared your intention to exterminate our entire species. That means we have nothing left to lose." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several representatives were now whispering urgently among themselves, their earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. "Do you understand what that means?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying an almost hypnotic intensity. "When a species has nothing left to lose, when they're facing extinction anyway, why would they care about preserving your infrastructure? Why would they care about minimizing casualties among your civilians? Why would they care about following any rules whatsoever?" Counselor Zixbury's mental voice was tight with strain. "The Galactic Council maintains the largest military force in known space. We could station fleets at every critical installation." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You could try. But tell me, Counselor, how many fleets would that require? And while those fleets are guarding your supply depots and manufacturing centers, who's protecting your homeworlds? Your colonies? Your trade routes?" The projection changed again, showing the vast scope of council space with thousands of potential targets, highlighted in red. 8 billion humans scattered across 12 systems with nothing left to lose and 3 months to prepare. How many of us would you need to catch to prevent catastrophic damage to your civilization? The question hung in the air, unanswered. "All of us," Marcus said quietly. "You'd need to catch every single human to ensure your safety. Miss even one, and critical infrastructure starts exploding. Miss a few hundred, and supply lines across the galaxy begin disappearing. Miss a few thousand." He let the sentence trail off, allowing their imaginations to fill in the implications. Veltar's voice was carefully controlled, but there was no mistaking the underlying tension. "You paint a picture of mutual destruction." "I paint a picture of reality," Marcus replied. "This is what happens when you back a species into a corner and threaten them with extinction. They stop playing by civilized rules and start playing by survival rules." He looked around the chamber one more time, meeting the eyes of every representative who would look back. But here's the truly interesting part. All of this, every supply depot, every communication relay, every critical installation that could be targeted, all of it becomes irrelevant if humanity simply disappears from the equation entirely. Several representatives leaned forward, sensing that Marcus was approaching the real point of his presentation. "Which brings us to the most important question of all," Marcus continued, his smile returning with renewed intensity. "How does the Galactic Council propose to actually exterminate humanity?" The question caught them off guard. For all their threats and ultimatums, none of them had apparently considered the practical logistics of genocide on an interstellar scale. "Your fleets could bombard our worlds," Marcus said, beginning to pace again. "But that would take time, and as I've just explained, we wouldn't spend that time passively waiting for death. Every day you delay to move your fleets into position is another day for human saboteurs to disappear into your territory." The pacing stopped. "You could try to blockade our systems, starve us into submission. But blockades work both ways, and the species fighting for survival becomes very creative about breaking through military cordons." Marcus turned to face Veltar directly. "Or you could try the direct approach. Send invasion forces to occupy our worlds. Hunt down every human being individually. But that would require putting millions of your people within reach of a species that, as I've just explained, no longer has any reason to follow the rules of civilized warfare." The silence stretched on for long moments before Counselor Zixbury finally spoke. "What are you proposing, human?" Marcus's expression grew serious. "I'm not proposing anything, Counselor. I'm simply pointing out that the Galactic Council has created an impossible situation. You've threatened a species with extinction while simultaneously making it impossible to carry out that extinction without catastrophic damage to your own civilization." He spread his arms wide. "So I have a question for this august body. Given these circumstances, what exactly do you intend to do with humanity?" For the first time since the proceedings began, the chamber erupted in genuine debate rather than orchestrated presentation. Representatives from dozens of species began arguing among themselves, their voices rising as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. Through it all, Marcus stood calmly in the center of the chaos, still smiling that unsettling smile, waiting to see how the most powerful political body in the galaxy would respond to the realization that they had just declared war on an enemy they couldn't actually defeat without destroying themselves in the process. The age of human diplomacy was indeed over, but the age of human warfare was proving to be far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The debate raged for nearly an hour before High Magistrate Veltar finally restored order. Her crystalline features showed the strain of the discussion, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of barely controlled frustration. "The council will recess for deliberation," she announced. "The human will be returned to his quarters while we consider our options." Marcus raised a hand, the gesture surprisingly commanding for someone who was supposedly a prisoner facing judgment. "If I may, High Magistrate, I have one more thing to add before you deliberate." Veltar's multifaceted eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have said quite enough already, human." "Have I?" Marcus asked, his tone conversational despite the tension filling the chamber. "Because I noticed that in all of your deliberations about humanity's fate, you've overlooked something rather important." Ambassador Grexmore's massive form shifted impatiently. "And what is that? Small human?" Marcus's smile took on an almost predatory quality. "You're assuming that humanity has been sitting passively in our systems for the past 3 months waiting to see what the Galactic Council decides." A cold chill seemed to settle over the chamber. Several representatives exchanged worried glances, and Councillor Zixpre's mental voice carried a sharp edge when she spoke. "Explain yourself." Marcus began pacing again, but this time his movement carried a different energy, not the calm confidence of an educator, but the purposeful stride of someone who held all the cards in a game the other players didn't even know they were playing. 3 months ago, he began, the Harmony's edge was captured. 3 months ago, I was taken into custody as humanity's final diplomatic representative. 3 months ago, the Galactic Council began its deliberations about our species' fate. He stopped pacing and looked directly up at Veltar. "What do you think humanity has been doing during those 3 months?" The question hung in the air like a toxin. Veltar's composed expression began to show cracks of uncertainty. "Your species was ordered to remain within your designated systems pending the Council's decision." "Ordered by whom?" Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious. "You? The council that was openly deliberating whether to exterminate us? The same council that offered us slavery as the merciful alternative to genocide?" He laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the crystalline chamber. "High Magistrate, let me ask you something. If someone was holding a gun to your head while deciding whether or not to pull the trigger, would you sit still and wait for their decision? Or would you do everything in your power to ensure that pulling that trigger would be the last mistake they ever made?" The implication hit the chamber like a shockwave. Representatives from dozens of species began speaking at once, their voices rising in alarm and outrage. "Silence!" Veltar commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Human, you will explain immediately what your species has done." Marcus stopped pacing and clasped his hands behind his back, adopting the stance of a professor delivering a lecture to particularly attentive students. "What we've done, High Magistrate, is what humans always do when faced with an impossible situation. We've gotten creative." The chamber's projection system activated again, but this time the images that appeared were not historical archives or tactical displays. They were real-time surveillance feeds from across council space, feeds that should have been classified and impossible for a human prisoner to access. "Station Omega in the Vega system," Marcus said, indicating one of the feeds. "Primary antimatter production facility for the Second Fleet. Population 40K. Critical strategic importance." The image showed what appeared to be normal operations. Ships docking, cargo being transferred, workers going about their daily routines. But there was something subtly wrong with the picture, something that made the watching representatives lean forward with growing unease. "Look closer," Marcus suggested. "Third docking bay, cargo manifest 77 Alpha. Standard shipping container registered to Meridian Trading Consortium, carrying industrial lubricants for the primary fusion reactors." The image zoomed in on an unremarkable shipping container being loaded onto a supply vessel. The Meridian Trading Consortium is a shell company established 2.5 months ago by human intelligence operatives. Those industrial lubricants are actually a binary explosive compound that becomes violently unstable when exposed to the specific electromagnetic frequencies generated by antimatter containment systems. A collective gasp arose from the assembled representatives. Ambassador Grexmore rose to his full height, his voice a rumbling growl of rage. "You dare attack our civilian installations?" Marcus looked up at him with an expression of mild surprise. Attack? Ambassador, that container hasn't exploded. It's just sitting there, waiting. Along with approximately 40,000 other containers currently distributed across Council space. The number hit the chamber like a physical blow. 40,000 potential bombs scattered across the galaxy's most critical infrastructure. Impossible, breathed Counselor Zixpree, her mental voice tight with strain. Our security protocols, our scanning procedures, are designed to detect known weapons and explosives, Marcus interrupted, but they're remarkably ineffective against substances that only become dangerous when combined in specific ways, or when exposed to particular environmental conditions. The projection changed again, showing a new feed from a different location. Communications Relay Station 12 in the Proxima system. Handles all military traffic for 3 entire sectors. That maintenance worker replacing the primary data routing crystals? He's actually Specialist Martinez, formerly of the Human Space Navy. Those aren't standard crystals. They're data miners that have been recording and transmitting every piece of military communication that passes through this facility for the past 6 weeks. Another feed appeared. Mining Platform 7 in the Centauri Belt. Processes rare minerals essential for Council weapons manufacturing. That new shipment of drilling equipment includes several components that will cause the primary refinement systems to fail catastrophically in approximately 72 hours, unless specific shutdown procedures are followed. Feed after feed appeared, each showing another critical Council facility, another human operative in place, another piece of infrastructure compromised. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. How? Veltar whispered, her composed demeanor finally cracking completely. How did your people penetrate our security so thoroughly? Marcus's expression grew almost pitying. High Magistrate, your security is designed to keep out the kinds of enemies you understand. Species that fight conventional wars for conventional reasons using conventional methods. He gestured toward the feed still playing overhead. But every one of these infiltrations was carried out using perfectly legal means. Merchant vessels with proper documentation. Workers with valid employment contracts. Materials that passed every scanner and inspection because they weren't weapons until they reached their targets. The implications were staggering. If humans could infiltrate Council territory so easily, if they could place operatives and equipment in the most secure facilities in known space... You're lying, Grexmore growled, but his voice lacked conviction. No species could coordinate an operation of this magnitude without our intelligence services detecting it. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right, Ambassador. No species could coordinate an operation like this using conventional methods. But then, humans stopped using conventional methods about the time we figured out that the universe was actively trying to kill us. The projection changed again, but this time it didn't show surveillance feeds or tactical displays. Instead, it showed something that made the assembled representatives' blood run cold. A real-time map of their own communication networks, with every message, every data packet, every classified transmission highlighted in real time as it passed through the systems. You see, Marcus continued conversationally. While the Council was debating humanity's fate, we were reading every word of those debates, every tactical assessment, every strategic plan, every security protocol, all transmitted through communication networks that we've had access to for months. Counselor Zixpree's mental voice was barely a whisper. Our quantum-encrypted channels are theoretically impossible to intercept. Theoretically, yes, Marcus agreed. But theory assumes that the intercepting party is trying to break the encryption. We didn't break anything. We just convinced your systems to give us the decryption keys voluntarily. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the environmental systems seemed to have stopped functioning. Social engineering, Marcus explained, apparently enjoying the look of complete bewilderment on the faces around him. It's much easier to trick someone into giving you their password than it is to crack their computer. And when you're dealing with bureaucracies that span thousands of star systems, there's always someone who can be convinced to help a friendly maintenance worker fix a critical system error. He began pacing again, his movement now carrying the confident stride of someone who had just revealed a winning hand in the galaxy's most dangerous poker game. So, here's where we stand, he continued. The Galactic Council has declared its intention to exterminate humanity. In response, humanity has placed 40,000 bombs in your most critical infrastructure, infiltrated your most secure facilities, and gained complete access to your communication networks. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face the entire chamber. But here's the beautiful part. We haven't actually done anything irreversible yet. Those bombs haven't exploded. Those data miners can be removed. Those sabotage systems can be repaired. The implication was clear, but Veltar needed to hear it stated explicitly. What do you want, human? Marcus's smile returned, broader and more unsettling than ever. What I want, High Magistrate, is to renegotiate the terms of this conversation. You are hardly in a position to make demands, Veltar said, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. Aren't I? Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious. Let's examine the current situation objectively. Humanity has demonstrated the ability to infiltrate Council space at will, compromise critical infrastructure, and access classified information. We've shown that we can strike at targets throughout your territory while remaining undetected. He gestured toward the feed still playing overhead. More importantly, we've proven that the Council's military superiority is irrelevant if we don't choose to engage in conventional warfare. Marcus paused, letting the implications sink in. So tell me, honored representatives, what exactly is your leverage in this negotiation? What can you threaten us with that's worse than the extinction you've already promised? The question hung in the air unanswered. For the first time in the proceedings, the Galactic Council found themselves in the unfamiliar position of having no clear response to a smaller power's defiance. However, Marcus continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, humanity is not unreasonable. We don't actually want to destroy Council civilization or cause unnecessary casualties. We just want to continue existing as a free and independent species. He stopped pacing and faced Veltar directly. So I'm prepared to make you an offer. We do not negotiate with terrorists, Ambassador Grexmore growled. Marcus looked up at him with an expression of mock surprise. Terrorists? Ambassador, I think you misunderstand the situation. Terrorists use violence to achieve political goals they couldn't accomplish through legitimate means. His expression grew serious. But humanity's goal is survival. And there's nothing more legitimate than a species' right to continue existing. He turned back to address the entire chamber. My offer is simple. The Galactic Council formally recognizes humanity's right to exist as an independent species. You withdraw your ultimatum, abandon any plans for military action against human space, and agree to treat us as equals in future diplomatic relations. And in exchange? Veltar asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. In exchange, Marcus said, his smile taking on a genuinely pleasant quality for the first time since the proceedings began, humanity dismantles all of the infrastructure we've put in place over the past 3 months. The bombs are disarmed and removed. The data miners are extracted. The sabotage is reversed. He paused for effect. And we promise never to do anything like this again as long as the Council honors its agreements. The silence stretched on for long moments as the assembled representatives grappled with the impossible situation they had created for themselves. Finally, Councillor Zixpri spoke, her mental voice tight with strain. And if the Council refuses your offer? Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes became infinitely colder. Then in approximately 72 hours, when the first wave of sabotage activates, the Council will discover exactly what happens when a species that has nothing left to lose decides to take everyone else down with them. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked around the chamber one final time. But I'm confident it won't come to that. After all, the Council has always prided itself on making rational decisions based on careful analysis of available options. Marx's smile returned, sharp and predatory. And right now, the most rational decision is obvious to everyone in this chamber. The age of human diplomacy might have been over, but the age of human leverage was just beginning. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 6 hours later, but the chamber felt different now. The confident authority that had marked the earlier proceedings had been replaced by something Marcus had never expected to see in this venue, genuine fear. High Magistrate Veltar's crystalline features showed the strain of the intervening hours. Her multifaceted eyes, which had once reflected absolute certainty, now carried the weight of impossible decisions and unacceptable alternatives. The Council has deliberated, she announced, her voice carrying across the chamber with none of its earlier authority. We have examined the humans' claims and verified the extent of the infiltration. Marcus stood in the center of the chamber, his maintenance coveralls somehow seeming less shabby and more like a uniform in the changed atmosphere. He remained silent, waiting for the magistrate to continue. The verification process has revealed penetration of Council infrastructure far beyond what was initially disclosed, Veltar continued, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Our security services have confirmed the presence of human operatives and equipment in over 800 critical facilities across 47 systems. A collective intake of breath echoed through the chamber. The number was staggering, far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Additionally, Veltar said, her voice growing even more strained, Our intelligence analysis suggests that the revealed infiltration represents only a fraction of the actual human presence in Council space. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The Council's intelligence services were finally beginning to grasp the scope of what they were dealing with. Ambassador Grexmore rose to his full 12-foot height, his massive form trembling with barely contained rage. This is intolerable. No species has ever dared to violate Council space so thoroughly. And yet, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, here we are. The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Grexmore's small eyes narrowed dangerously, but he made no further comment. Counselor Zixpre's mental voice carried a note of desperate hope when she spoke. Perhaps accommodation can be reached. The Council is prepared to modify its position regarding humanity's future. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression one of polite interest. I'm listening. Veltar cleared her throat, the sound somehow carrying the weight of galactic political authority surrendering to practical reality. The Council withdraws its ultimatum regarding human extinction or subjugation. We are prepared to recognize humanity's right to exist within the current boundaries of your 12 systems. Current boundaries, Marcus repeated, his tone carefully neutral. That's an interesting phrase, High Magistrate. Humanity will be permitted to maintain its existing colonies and infrastructure, Veltar continued, in exchange for the immediate removal of all human operatives and equipment from Council space, and a binding agreement to respect Council territorial sovereignty in the future. Marcus nodded slowly as if considering the offer. And what guarantees would humanity have that the Council won't simply wait for us to withdraw our leverage before reconsidering this generous offer? You have our word, Veltar said, though even she seemed to realize how hollow the statement sounded. High Magistrate, less than 8 hours ago this same Council was debating whether to enslave or exterminate my entire species. You'll forgive me if your word carries somewhat less weight than it might have yesterday. The accuracy of the statement was undeniable, and several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What assurances do you require? Veltar asked, her voice tight with frustration. Marcus began pacing again, his movement carrying the confident stride of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. The problem, as I see it, is one of credibility. The Council has made it clear that it views humanity as a threat to galactic stability. Even if you withdraw your current ultimatum, what's to prevent you from declaring us a threat again in a few years or decades when the memory of this conversation has faded? He stopped pacing and faced the assembled representatives. Humanity needs more than promises. We need structural guarantees. Explain, Counselor Zixpre demanded, her mental voice sharp with impatience. Marcus's expression grew serious. First, humanity requires full membership in the Galactic Council with all the rights and protections that membership provides. The response was immediate and explosive. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting simultaneously, their voices rising in outrage and disbelief. Impossible, roared Grexmore. Council membership requires centuries of demonstrated stability and cooperation. The human species has existed in space for less than a standard century, added another representative. They lack the maturity for Council responsibilities. Through the chaos, Marcus stood perfectly still, waiting for the storm to subside. When it finally did, he spoke with calm authority. I understand your concerns, he said, his tone suggesting that he understood them and found them irrelevant. But consider the alternative. Humanity has demonstrated the ability to infiltrate your most secure facilities and compromise your most critical infrastructure. Do you really want a species with those capabilities operating outside Council oversight? The question gave the representatives pause. Several of them exchanged worried glances as the implications sank in. Council membership would give humanity a voice in galactic affairs, Marcus continued. It would provide us with peaceful means to resolve future disputes. Most importantly, it would give us a stake in maintaining the stability of the current system. Veltar's voice carried a note of desperate hope. And if the Council agrees to consider humanity for membership, then the withdrawal of human assets from Council space can begin immediately, Marcus replied. As a gesture of good faith, we're prepared to provide complete intelligence on our operational capabilities and methods to help you improve your security against less cooperative species. The offer was tempting, but several representatives remained skeptical. This sets a dangerous precedent, warned Representative Kethmal of the Rigelian Federation. If one species can threaten its way into Council membership, what prevents others from attempting the same? Marcus's smile returned, sharp and predatory. The same thing that prevents them from attempting it now, Representative. They lack the capability. He began pacing again, his movement carrying the rhythm of someone building to a crucial point. You see, this isn't really about humanity's membership in the Council. This is about the fact that the galaxy has changed, and the Council hasn't adapted to that change. The chamber fell silent as the representatives tried to understand where Marcus was leading them. For millennia, Marcus continued, galactic politics has operated on the assumption that technological superiority equals military superiority, and military superiority equals political dominance. The strongest species rule, the weaker species submit, and everyone knows their place in the hierarchy. He stopped pacing and turned to address the entire chamber. But what happens when a species develops capabilities that make traditional military strength irrelevant? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. What happens when a civilization discovers ways to project power that don't require massive fleets or occupying armies? What happens when the ability to cause catastrophic damage becomes divorced from the ability to survive retaliatory strikes? Marcus gestured toward the feed still playing overhead, showing the vast network of compromised council facilities. You're looking at the future of galactic politics, honored representatives. Not the crude territorial conquest of the past, but something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. Councillor Zixpre's mental voice carried a note of genuine fear. You speak of asymmetric warfare on a galactic scale? I speak of evolution, Marcus replied. The same evolutionary pressure that turned humans into a species capable of surviving anything the universe could throw at them has now produced a form of warfare that makes traditional military superiority obsolete. The implications were staggering, and several representatives were now engaged in urgent whispered conversations. And here's the truly terrifying part, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Humanity isn't unique in this regard. We're just the first. That statement hit the chamber like a physical blow. Representatives from dozens of species stared at Marcus in horror, as the full scope of what he was suggesting became clear. Every species in this galaxy has faced extinction-level threats at some point in their history, Marcus said, his tone carrying the authority of someone stating undeniable facts. Most of them overcame those threats through technological advancement, social cooperation, or military conquest. But a few, a very few, survived by learning to think differently. He gestured toward the council representatives. You've all been so focused on maintaining the stability of the current system that you've ignored the signs of what's coming. There are species out there right now developing capabilities that will make today's demonstration look like a children's game. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Council was being forced to confront the possibility that their entire worldview was obsolete. So, here's what I propose, Marcus said, his voice returning to its earlier businesslike tone. The Council faces a choice. You can continue operating under the old assumptions, waiting for each new threat to emerge and trying to deal with it through traditional military means. Or you can evolve. Evolve how? Veltar asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Marcus's expression grew deadly serious. By recognizing that the age of species-level extinction threats is over, by understanding that in the new paradigm, every civilization must have a stake in galactic stability, regardless of their military strength or territorial holdings. He paused, letting the implications sink in. By expanding council membership to include every species capable of projecting asymmetric power, and by developing new frameworks for managing conflicts that can't be resolved through traditional warfare, the proposal was radical beyond anything the council had ever considered, but the alternative was becoming increasingly clear to everyone present. In short, Marcus concluded, the council can choose to lead the galaxy into a new age of cooperation and mutual security, or it can wait for that new age to be imposed through a series of increasingly destructive demonstrations like the one you've witnessed today. Veltar looked around the chamber, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the faces of representatives who had never imagined they would face such impossible choices. And if the council chooses the path you suggest, she asked. Marcus's smile returned, but this time it carried a note of genuine warmth. Then humanity will be proud to serve as the council's first partner in building that new future. We'll share our methods, help develop new security protocols, and work to ensure that future species with asymmetric capabilities are brought into the system peacefully. He paused, then added with quiet intensity, but if the council chooses to maintain the status quo, Marcus didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The chamber full of compromised infrastructure and infiltrated facilities spoke for itself. The age of human warfare was ending before it had truly begun. But the age of human influence in galactic politics was just getting started, and the most powerful beings in the galaxy were beginning to understand that their choice was no longer between dominating humanity or destroying it. Their choice was between evolution and extinction, and they were rapidly running out of time to decide. 6 months after the emergency session that had changed the course of galactic history, Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of Nexus Station, watching as the largest construction project in recorded history took shape in the void beyond. The new council chambers were being built in neutral space, incorporating design elements from hundreds of different species, including, for the first time, humanity. The irony wasn't lost on him. A maintenance engineer from Earth's outer colonies was now watching the construction of a building where he would soon sit as humanity's first representative to the Galactic Council. "It's quite impressive," came a familiar crystalline voice from behind him. High Magistrate Veltar approached, her forearms carrying a data tablet that displayed the construction timeline. The architects estimate completion within another 2 standard months. Marcus turned to face her, noting the changes that 6 months of unprecedented political upheaval had wrought in the once unshakable council leader. Her multifaceted eyes carried a weariness that hadn't been there during their first encounter, but also something else, a cautious optimism that suggested she was beginning to see possibilities rather than just problems. "It's a beautiful design," Marcus agreed, turning back to watch the massive construction mechs assembling the station's superstructure. "Though I have to admit, I never expected to see Korathian architectural principles integrated with Nexari meditation gardens and human industrial efficiency." Veltar moved to stand beside him at the observation window. "The integration has not been without challenges. Ambassador Grexmore continues to express concerns about structural integrity, while the Nexari Collective remains skeptical of the human insistence on redundant safety systems." Marcus smiled. "Let me guess. They think our paranoia about catastrophic system failures is excessive?" "They consider it neurotic," Veltar admitted, until our security analysts explained that human paranoia had successfully identified and exploited weaknesses in systems that our best engineers had considered foolproof. The conversation paused as they watched a squadron of human construction drones coordinating with Zephyrian gravity manipulators to position a massive support beam. The efficiency of the cooperation was remarkable, considering that 6 months earlier these species had been preparing for mutual annihilation. "I must confess," Veltar said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration, "the transition has proceeded far more smoothly than anyone anticipated." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "The easy part was convincing the Council to change its approach. The hard part is making sure the new system actually works." "You speak as if you have concerns about the outcome." "I have concerns about human nature," Marcus replied, his tone growing serious. "We're very good at surviving impossible situations and finding creative solutions to complex problems. But we're also very good at getting bored when things become stable and predictable." He turned away from the window to face Veltar directly. "The question isn't whether humanity can adapt to galactic politics. The question is whether galactic politics can survive humanity's adaptation to it." Veltar's crystalline features showed confusion. "I do not understand." Marcus began pacing, a habit that had become familiar to anyone who worked with him regularly. "Humans are problem solvers by nature. When we encounter a system that isn't working efficiently, we fix it. When we find processes that can be improved, we improve them. When we see opportunities for optimization, we optimize." "These sound like positive characteristics." "They are," Marcus agreed, "until you consider what happens when humans decide that the entire galactic political system is a problem that needs to be solved." The implication hung in the air between them. Veltar's multifaceted eyes widened slightly as she began to grasp what Marcus was suggesting. "You believe humanity will attempt to restructure galactic civilization?" Marcus stopped pacing and gave her a look that was equal parts sympathetic and apologetic. "High Magistrate, humanity spent 3 months infiltrating your most secure facilities, compromising your most critical infrastructure, and gaining access to your most classified information. We did all of this while supposedly confined to our own systems under Council observation." He paused to let the implications sink in. "What do you think we're going to accomplish now that we have legitimate access to galactic institutions, 6 months to study how everything actually works, and official status as Council partners?" Veltar was silent for several long moments, clearly grappling with the ramifications of what Marcus was telling her. "Are you warning me that humanity cannot be trusted?" she finally asked. "I'm warning you that humanity is about to discover just how inefficient the current galactic system really is," Marcus replied. "And once we discover that, we're going to have a very hard time not fixing it." Before Veltar could respond, Marcus's communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. He glanced at the display, and his expression grew serious. "Speaking of which," he said, "I need to take this call. It's from the Human Integration Committee." Veltar nodded and moved away to give him privacy, but she remained within earshot, a precaution that had become standard practice whenever human officials received communications. Marcus activated his communicator, and a holographic image of Dr. Sarah Martinez materialized in front of him. She was the head of humanity's transition team, responsible for coordinating their integration into galactic institutions. "Marcus," she said without preamble, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where our efficiency consultants have identified 17 major inefficiencies in the Council's resource allocation systems. Our logistics specialists have found ways to reduce shipping costs by 40% across the entire galactic trade network, and our systems analysts have discovered that we can eliminate approximately 60% of the bureaucratic overhead in interstellar commerce." Marcus closed his eyes and sighed. "How long?" "6 weeks," Sarah replied. "Our people have been in their positions for 6 weeks, and they've already identified enough systemic improvements to revolutionize galactic civilization." "And I assume they want to implement these improvements?" "They've prepared preliminary reports," Sarah said, her tone suggesting that she knew exactly how problematic this was going to be. "Complete with cost-benefit analyses, implementation timelines, and projected efficiency gains." Marcus opened his eyes and looked toward where Veltar was standing, pretending not to listen to his conversation. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that implementing their recommendations would essentially require rebuilding galactic civilization from the ground up," Sarah admitted. "Good enough that ignoring their recommendations would be criminal negligence on a galactic scale." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "Send me the reports," he finally said. "All of them." "Marcus, there are over 300 reports covering everything from agricultural optimization to hyperspace traffic management. They represent approximately 40,000 hours of analysis. "I'll read them tonight," Marcus said. "In the meantime, tell our people to keep their recommendations to themselves until we figure out how to present this information without starting a galactic civil war." Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't optimistic about their chances. "What do you want me to tell them when they ask why we're sitting on solutions to problems that are costing trillions of lives and resources every year?" Marcus looked out at the construction site again, watching the various species working together to build something that had never existed before in galactic history. "Tell them we're learning the difference between being right and being effective." After ending the call, Marcus turned to find Veltar studying him with an expression of growing concern. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough," Veltar replied. "Are you telling me that humanity has already identified ways to improve galactic civilization?" Marcus's expression grew rueful. "I'm telling you that humanity has already identified ways to completely revolutionize galactic civilization. The question is whether we can figure out how to implement those improvements without destroying the political stability we've all worked so hard to achieve." Veltar was quiet for several moments, clearly processing the implications of what she'd just learned. "What do you propose?" she finally asked. Marcus began pacing again, his movement carrying the focused energy of someone working through a complex problem. "We need to create a framework for gradual implementation of systemic improvements. Something that allows for optimization without destabilization." "That sounds remarkably vague." "Because it is vague," Marcus admitted. "We're dealing with a completely unprecedented situation. No species in galactic history has ever had to manage the integration of a civilization that's systematically better at solving problems than everyone else." He stopped pacing and faced Veltar directly. "But here's what I know for certain. If we don't find a way to channel humanity's problem-solving instincts constructively, they're going to find their own outlets. And based on what we've accomplished in the past 6 months, I don't think anyone wants to see what unauthorized human optimization of galactic civilization looks like." Veltar's crystalline features showed a mixture of fascination and terror. "You speak as if your species is incapable of leaving well enough alone." Marcus laughed, and the sound carried no humor whatsoever. "Hi, Magistrate. Humans are the species that looked at the concept of good enough and decided it was a personal insult. We're the species that invented the phrase, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. We're the species that sees a perfectly functional system and immediately starts asking, but how can we make it better?" He gestured toward the construction site, where human efficiency innovations were already reducing construction time by 30%. "You invited us into galactic civilization thinking we'd be grateful for the opportunity to participate. What you actually did was give the galaxy's most obsessive optimizers access to the largest, most complex, most inefficient system in the universe." The implications of that statement settled over them like a heavy weight. "So what happens now?" Veltar asked. Marcus turned back to watch the construction crews, his expression thoughtful. "Now we find out whether galactic civilization is ready for the most comprehensive upgrade in its history. Whether that upgrade happens gradually through careful planning and diplomatic coordination, or rapidly through unauthorized human intervention, depends on how quickly the Council can adapt to having partners who are constitutionally incapable of accepting inefficiency." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "But one way or another, High Magistrate, galactic civilization is about to change. The only question is whether that change is going to be managed or whether it's going to be imposed." Veltar looked out at the construction site, watching species that had never cooperated before working together with unprecedented efficiency. "And if the Council chooses to resist these changes?" Marcus's smile returned, carrying the same predatory quality that had once terrified the most powerful political body in the galaxy. "Then the Council will discover that saying no to human innovation is roughly as effective as saying no to entropy, gravity, or the speed of light." "You make it sound inevitable." "High Magistrate," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "human progress is the most inevitable force in the universe. We've spent our entire evolutionary history turning impossible problems into routine solutions. The only difference now is that we're working on galactic-scale problems instead of planetary ones." As if to underscore his point, a section of the new council chambers that should have taken weeks to complete was finished in a matter of hours, thanks to human optimization of the construction process. "The age of human integration is ending," Marcus said, watching the impossible pace of progress with satisfaction. "The age of human optimization has begun, and by the time we're finished, the galaxy won't just be a better place to live, it'll be the best place to live that physics and engineering can possibly create." Veltar looked at him with a mixture of anticipation and terror. "And if we're not ready for that level of change?" Marcus's expression grew deadly serious. "Then you better get ready quickly, because ready or not, the future is coming. And it's being designed, built, and optimized by the species that never learned how to accept impossible as an answer." In the distance, the new council chambers continued to rise, a testament to what could be accomplished when the galaxy's most stubborn species was finally given the resources and authority to fix everything they'd been patiently observing for months. The age of human compliance was over. The age of human leadership was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a species is give them exactly what they've been asking for.